Have you ever felt like you can't find that perfect main? Maybe even worse, you're grinding the wrong main when your max potential is on a different hero? Finding that perfect main or mains can be integral to finding your Overwatch playstyle and skyrocketing your rank. Now, this is a new and improved version of a video we made about a year ago. That being said, one of the biggest questions on that video was, why should you find a main or mains in the first place? While I want to make it extremely clear that you can succeed with any character in Overwatch, it's also important to understand that if you play way too many characters, you're hurting your development on the characters you want to get good with. Being great at 2 or 3 characters is going to be far better than being just okay or even bad at 10 plus characters. Oftentimes, effort compounds, and the value that you're gonna get out of characters is gonna be amplified the more time and effort you put into specific ones. That's why your time is valuable, and consider this video an investment into deciding what to spend your time on, so you're not wasting your time grinding things that you're not gonna end up developing or improving with down the line. Now we're going to break down every single role and split them into categories so that you can better decide what heroes you want to play in main. Starting off with the tanking category. Now in the tanking category, there are 2 major things that differentiate tanks: their effective range and their mobility. There will be some heroes that overlap in these categories, but we'll get to that at the end. First off is close range and no vertical mobility. If you're a tank that doesn't have the means to take the high ground out of nowhere and your effective range is very close to the enemy, meaning you need to close that distance, then you're gonna most likely be a Brawl tank. This is characters like Queen, Zarya, Rein, characters that want to close in the gap, they want to get into their effective close range, and they really want to take the fight to the enemy, right? So a lot of the skill involving these characters is setting up the types of engagements you want, right? Queen is oftentimes playing natural cover, looking for an opportunity, closing in that gap with shout. Rein, very similar, finding situations where he can challenge the enemy directly and get swings in and get a lot of pressure and value on the front line. In order to succeed with Brawl characters, you need to think about how you're going to navigate the map, what are the matchups between you and characters that don't have the same effective range as you, and how you're going to close in that gap as quickly and as effectively as you can while maintaining resources as a team, whether that's your health, your cooldowns, or your teammates' health, cooldowns, heals, or anything else. And while this type of composition or character can thrive if they set up the right conditions, there are a lot of obstacles against them, most namely the fact that they don't have any form of vertical mobility, which means if there's maps with extra high ground, maps where enemies are above them pointing down, or maps with really diverse terrain, then Brawl tanks can suffer because they don't get to fight in the way they want to. Now, there are certain ways that you could set up the right types of engagements for your team. It could be ignoring the objective and routing around the map and clearing high ground or taking the fight to the enemy, or it could be forcing enemies to contest an objective and coming right into your effective range. But the next type of tank that we're going to talk about is the far range with no vertical mobility as well. And this is going to be a poke composition. Characters like Sigma, Mauga, and Orisa. Although some of these characters do overlap, like both Mauga and Orisa do overlap quite a bit. You can play Mauga in a Brawl comp, you can play Orisa in a Brawl technically. And I want you to kind of imagine that every single character is in like a Venn diagram where they cross over other types of things. And there are ways to play characters untraditionally that move them closer in line with a different type of tank and composition. And I know that some of you are already typing in the chat and commenting, actually you can play Sigma in Brawl, but keep in mind the goal here is to have people understand how things are normally played and traditionally played. Otherwise, you're gonna really confuse people that are trying to learn, so we'll just keep it like that for now. Now, last up is close range and vertical mobility, and if you're in this category, you are a dive tank. And there's examples of this like Doomfist, Winston, and Diva. Characters that want to close in the gap oftentimes take the fight to the enemy team, but they have the means to do this with high amounts of mobility, either going to the high ground or surgically targeting a weakness in the enemy team. Winston's can jump in and either isolate a target and kill them, or cut off the front line from the back line, denying the enemy tank heals. Characters like Diva can take the fight to an individual and challenge the high ground or people on the high ground directly. And if you're someone that really likes fast mobility, identifying weaknesses and punishing those weaknesses, then dive characters are going to be a really great fit for you. Now, it's really important that I reiterate that heroes are much more flexible than one style or composition. While I did say that vertical mobility was a requirement for a dive hero, this is not always the case because there's not always a need to take verticality in a composition. As an example to this, we see characters like Junker Queen played in dive compositions in pro play, namely because on some of the flatter maps, you don't need to be able to target a high ground, you just need to go fast and have mobility, which Junker Queen Shout provides. And being able to play natural cover, pounce, spread around, and then engage with a shout to aid a dive is super powerful. And it really is a testament to how complex Overwatch can be, and I would much rather you think about what your characters can do and the types of situations that they thrive in, rather than thinking every composition is solved or every character has to go with another character or something like that. There's something that you should consider before you pick your mains is that some heroes are far harder to counter than others. Characters like Sigma really are very difficult to counter because they have the tools to deal with a variety of different comps and set the pace of play to what they want to do. But there's other characters that have a much harder time dealing with counters, like Wrecking Ball, for example, that have individual characters that can really counter his entire playstyle or make you play in a really passive and rather frustrating way. I would say how flexible you have to be in any of the roles depends on how easy it is to counter the characters that you play. No one wants to have to swap all the time, but the reality of it is, if you're only good at one type of character, players will constantly swap to counter you and make it so that you're just not having a good time game after game. So it's a good idea that the easier it is for your heroes to get countered, the more flexible you are to other heroes in the role, without being overly flexible for many of the reasons we already named. Now, before we finish up the tank role and talk about DPS and support, if you learned anything or if you enjoy my content, do me a solid and press that subscribe. And if I don't get your subscription today, let me know down below what type of video you want to see to earn that subscription, and I'll be right on it. But let's get back to the video. Now, something you should ask yourself is, how do you like to play? Do you want to attrition, denial, or have a more fluid playstyle? Attrition would be someone that is going to whittle down enemy resources, actively manage ultimates, and try to find key ways that they get small advantages over the course of a long fight, characters like Sigma, for example. Denial is punishing or preventing enemies from doing what they want to do. A character like D.Va can keep off angles clear and actively deny cooldowns and ultimates with her DM. Some characters are extremely fluid in the way they play, and they give you a lot of freedom for how you want to approach different situations. Characters like Doomfist and Wrecking Ball can often match this playstyle. The last thing to consider for tank, that honestly will be relevant for the other roles as well, is what way mechanically do you want to be challenged? Some tanks require a high aim skill. Characters like Zarya and D.Va require great tracking to reach the skill ceiling on these characters. While some characters are allowing you to take a slow and methodical pace of play, like Sigma for instance, because you're whittling down resources and trading resources with the opponent, other characters like Doomfist are going to require much more dynamic gameplay, much faster gameplay, so your reaction time will get challenged and the entire pace of play will be fundamentally different. Now, of course, we got to move on to the next role, DPS. Now, there's several different roles in the DPS category, and once again, there will be some overlap, but bear with me for a second. First off, we're going to talk about Hitscan. And while some characters are technically Hitscan like Reaper and Tracer, the characters that I'm actually going to put in the Hitscan category are going to be long distant point and click characters. This will be characters like Ashe, characters like Widowmaker, and technically Cassidy as well. Now, while every single one of these characters are going to have different effective ranges, they're all going to want to understand that range really, really well. Exactly where they are effective at taking duels and being lethal threats to the enemy. While a character like Widowmaker will have a really long effective range, characters like Cassidy will be a much closer effective range, but still further away than a lot of close range melee characters or other characters that have weapons that want them to be right on top of the enemy. Next up, we have to talk about Projectile DPS, and these are characters that have bullets that do have travel time, so oftentimes you're going to need to predict where enemies' movements are going to be, or you need to understand enemy movement and kind of spam in their general direction depending on your character. This would be characters like Pharah, Junkrat, Echo. All of these are technically projectile DPS, but it's important to understand that while there's a lot of similarities with the mechanical aspect of hit scans, like an Ashe player can easily become a Widow player, and even a Cass player, because there is a lot of mechanical overlap, that's not necessarily always true in the projectile role. I mean, Pharah and Junkrat can sometimes overlap, but oftentimes mechanically don't have a lot of similarities. And then there's the flex section of DPS, which is kind of just DPS DPS that don't really have like a clear-cut hit scan or projectile. For example, characters like Tracer and Sombra are technically hit scan, but they don't share the playstyle similarities of any of the hit scans that we already talked about because of how they want to engage the enemy, right? Tracer and Sombra want to get up close personal. They have a really close effective range, and they use their dynamic mobility to get in close, so they play way different from any of the other hit scans. Now, not to confuse things further, but there are also characters that are technically projectile that play like hit scans. As an example, Hanzo. One of the things we see a lot in scrim play is that hit scan players will play Hanzo if they're not on like a dedicated hit scan like Widowmaker. And the reason that that has been the case in the past is because a lot of the positioning and skill aspects of a hit scan is shared by Hanzo, right? Think about the playstyles between Ashe and Hanzo. They're very similar in the places and positions they play in. And the reason that you need to know what characters share playstyle similarities and mechanical similarities with each other is because it becomes a lot easier for you to venture out into other characters if they share something, right? If I'm playing a character like Widowmaker that has a certain type of mechanical skill and a certain type of ranged playstyle that I'm really locked in on, it's gonna be really weird for me to then go to Junkrat, right? Because they don't do anything similar from a playstyle or mechanical point of view. And in some cases, it could be worth it to learn two mains that are very different from one another if they don't actually allow you to be a more versatile player where you're picking these characters on certain maps that are kind of filling in the gaps of your kit. Then most of the time you would be wasting your effort trying to really grind to become like a GM level Widow and a GM level Junkrat in one. Now, more importantly than knowing the classifications of characters, you need to know how you like to play. And similar to the tank category, there are different ways that you can play DPS. One is mobility. If you want to move around a lot, and that's your favorite thing to do, there's a lot of characters that could fit that across the roles. Characters like Pharah, Echo, Tracer, Sombra, Genji, these have great mobility options. Another thing that you might like to do is a pick-oriented playstyle. You play characters like Widowmaker that get picks and pick-offs and oftentimes can turn the battlefield with their neutral abilities. Or you can talk about a character in the attrition category, characters that get a lot of value over time. A character like Junkrat is the perfect example of a character that is gonna deny space and whittle down enemy resources as they cross through that space. And then last up, there's dueling. There's a lot of characters that have pretty decent one-on-one capabilities, characters like Genji, characters like Cass, and oftentimes characters will be able to do multiple ones of these, right? Genji is mobility and dueling. There's characters that could do a lot of different things, but it's important to understand what you like to do and how you like to play and what certain characters' strengths and weaknesses are when you're trying to decide your main. Now, exactly like we talked about with the tank role, some DPS are going to be really easy to counter and others are going to be very difficult to counter. Let's take a character like Pharah, for example. There's a lot of characters that can interact with Pharah very favorably. Characters like Diva, characters like Cassidy, Widowmaker, Ashe, characters like Alari or Ana. A lot of these characters can do a lot to the Pharah. And there is going to be some amount of counterplay there depending on how good you are at Pharah to still make the character work, but it's also going to be frustrating in some cases where you have to play fundamentally different. And you have to decide whether or not it's worth it to change up your playstyle in order to succeed up against these counters. An example of a character that is easy to counter but hard to hard counter is Tracer. Tracer has a million characters that can be difficult to deal with. Characters that can one-shot her, characters that can threaten her, characters like Brig that can deny her, but a good Tracer can adapt their playstyle to stay alive and get value with pulses or just find the right moment to go in. So even though you have to dramatically change up your playstyle up against certain soft counters, you're not completely out of the game and you can still carry. Some characters, though, are almost impossible to completely shut down. Like a character like Soldier does have some bad matchups here and there against skilled players, but because of his pretty neutral mobility and fundamental playstyle based around him being able to heal himself and take off angles, Soldier's never going to be someone that you're able to just fully shut down and prevent from getting any value at all. Once again, if you play a character that's really easy to hard counter especially, you're more likely to want to have other characters that you could swap to, especially characters that are reasonably decent against the characters that shut you down. And the last up is how mechanically do you want to be challenged? There's tracking based mechanics where you're oftentimes going to be locked onto the target and following them through an entire range of motion. So characters like Tracer and Soldier and things like that. There's flicking based, which is going to be based on micro flicks oftentimes that you are reacting to in a moment's notice. So characters like Widow and Cass. However, tracking is still an extremely important aspect of aiming regardless of what characters you're playing on. But with a character like Tracer, for instance, you're not necessarily flicking to a target to get one little pellet off, right? It's not going to do anything that is make or break mechanically for the character. And then there's also like reaction-based characters, or characters that are going to test you in a very specific moment where you're going to have to make a lot of complex decisions, right? Characters like Genji and Venture could potentially be under this category. And even not mechanically, there are some characters that don't require complex mechanics, but require you to think a little bit more critically about your engages and your cooldown cycles. A character like Mei, for instance, is often going to be based on how you can get value out of your wall and your positioning. But keep in mind, if you pick a character that is mechanically demanding to get value, you need to be practicing your mechanics, putting time and effort into making those better, mainly because your mechanical skill is so directly tied to your impact. But it's also perfectly okay to not want to go on that grind and play other characters that don't require that same level of mechanical trial and error and warm-up and routine. Now, last but certainly not least, we have support. And in the support category, we often split these up by raw mechanical skill. And in a scrim or professional setting, a main support would be a support that doesn't require advanced mechanical skill in order to get value out of, even at the highest level. So characters like Brig, Mercy, Lucio, Moira, Lifeweaver, all these characters could be played even if you don't have amazing level mechanics. Like, you could have average level aim mechanics, but still be a Grandmaster plus level Mercy or Moira. Now, in the scrim settings, off support is characters that do require great aim in order to get most value out of the character, or it's recommended to have in order to get a lot of value out of the character. This would include Ana, Zen, Bap, and Alari. Now, keep in mind that there is mechanical skill with main supports. It's just not overlapping mechanical skill in the same way that off supports have overlapping aim mechanical skill. So, as an example, Lucio definitely has high levels of mechanical skill, but the mechanical skill you're learning on Lucio isn't aim mechanical skill that you would be learning on like an Alari and an Ana together. So if you have great aim mechanics, those things transfer over throughout the off support role when they wouldn't necessarily transfer over between like Brig Tech and Lucio or Mercy Tech. It's also important to understand this distinction because you can climb incredibly high in rank on a main support without building that aim mechanical skill, but you're gonna get capped a lot sooner if you don't have great mechanics at one of the off support characters. It's gonna be the thing that is limiting you from getting as much value as you otherwise would. Like, if you have terrible aim skill, I think you could still get really high rank on a character like Moira, but if you don't have great aim skill, I think you're gonna really suffer on a character like Ana at a certain point. And if there's a huge disconnect between your understanding of the game and your mechanical skill, and you have a hero pool that's a combination of main and off supports, some characters you're going to be way worse on unless you actually develop that mechanical skill further. Now, even though they separate them in this way, it's not to say that main or off supports share playstyles, because actually a lot of the supports have fundamentally different playstyles that you have to decide what you enjoy doing the most. Brig is a character that operates under denial, someone that is denying the enemy plays and denying the enemy space, and at the same time protection. So they are the bodyguard for your team. If a diva flies in, they can whip him back. If the Ana gets dove, they can pack him and get the characters off them. Brig is a character that sees really valuable targets on their team that they want to protect and enable, and keeps them alive even under constant duress. If you're someone that wants to be that big bouncer that shuts down the enemy team over and over again, then Brig might be the perfect character for you. Next up is Pocket, and that's Mercy. Very unique playstyle in the support role, a character that gets the primary amount of her value by enabling another character. Finding the perfect person to enable, increase their damage output, and keep them alive, giving them extra lives in some situations. Mercy is a very unique character that does require a good understanding of the battlefield, a really good understanding of your threats, and being able to think a little bit in advance in order to get the most value. Now, Lucio is going to be a character with a lot of diverse playstyles. There's an enable playstyle on Lucio that is about enabling their team, speeding them in, or enabling and speeding in a single person on an off angle, for instance. There's a peel-based playstyle on Lucio that allows you to deny enemy plays and is kind of similar in design as Brig, although it's something that you're going to do in a key moment, not something that you're going to do all the time. And then there's the Reddit style, which is running it down and fragging on Lucio, but that style is definitely going to require higher mechanical skill than the other ones do. Now, some characters like Zen and Alari are going to be incredibly damage focused, characters that are going to be looking for opportunities to apply pressure, get picks, and really help their DPS confirm kills that they otherwise wouldn't be able to get. You're either forcing people out of position to back up and allow your team to take more space, or you're actually generating picks yourself or allowing your DPS to generate picks, which could just win a team fight by itself. These are heavily mechanically focused characters, and if there was like a Venn diagram, once again, these characters would overlap with a lot of the features of DPS. And it's important to understand that some of the differences between DPS and supports are not that far apart, and they're more similar than you might think. As an example, an Alari and an Ashe share a lot more in common than like a Zen and a Mercy. So there are some cases where a support and a DPS are more closely related in playstyle and mechanical skill than two supports. So keep that in mind if you're going to be playing multiple roles and you're looking for characters to play across roles. Now, something that you could consider is that supports will often play fundamentally different depending on what their other support is and what their tank is. The important thing to consider is what your overall sustained output is, as in how much heals are you dumping out versus how much resources does your team need. Let's say that you're playing a Wrecking Ball Tracer Sombra composition. You don't need a lot of heals in that composition. And you might be thinking, okay, we don't need a lot of heals because we have a lot of independent or self-sufficient characters, so I don't need to play a character that can provide a ton of heals like Ana or Bap. But you could definitely play these characters, but change up your playstyle so that you're a lot more damage and playmaking centric. I would say that in general, supports change their playstyle a lot more based on their team than their opponents versus what the other roles do. Now, I think there's something that a lot of people overlook when trying to find their perfect main, and it's not about the meta or what is most optimized. It's about what you enjoy. I know that that is not the most popular answer, but honestly, if you're going to get good at any character, you need to play that character a lot. You need to be able to stick with that character through a lot of repetitions, a lot of games, and truly master that character. So regardless of whether or not a character is optimal, if you don't enjoy it, if you're not having fun, and if you're not able to play that character for the foreseeable future, then I would not suggest it. It doesn't matter how good that character is in the meta. It really comes down to what you personally like and what you could see yourself grinding for game after game for a very long time. Anyways, I hope this game has helped you understand exactly what characters do and how they fit into your potential future hero pool. But let me know if you have any questions in the comments down below. If you learned something, then I think I earned that subscribe button. But if I didn't, let me know down below what kind of video you want to see next that would, and I really would appreciate it. Thank you, and I'll see you next time.